A town called Hope. New York, 1917. Felicia Wright noticed that an old letter on her desk, signed by Corporal Martin Ellis, slowly lost its ink as if erasing his presence, leaving her to question what remains. Chapter 1. The Phantom Ink of Corporal Ellis. The letter lay on Felicia Wright's mahogany desk, a stark white rectangle against the polished wood, a silent scream in the otherwise orderly room. It was the signature that drew her eye, or rather, what was left of it. Corporal Martin Ellis. Just yesterday, the name had been penned in a bold, confident hand, a testament to the man she remembered meeting at her sister's engagement party, only a few months before he'd shipped off to Europe. Now, the Ian Ellis was almost completely gone, a faint smudge of gray where a crisp, black loop and line had once been. The rest of the signature was fading, too, the ink thinning, withdrawing like a tide receding from the shore, leaving behind only the ghostly impression of what had been. Felicia picked up the letter, the crisp paper feeling strangely cold against her fingertips. It was dated 3 weeks prior, a seemingly innocuous missive from the front, filled with the usual platitudes assurances of his well-being, vague descriptions of the French countryside, carefully worded hopes for a swift end to the war. Nothing that should have caused the War Department any undue concern, nothing that hinted at the creeping dread that now coiled in Felicia's stomach. She'd read it countless times, searching for some hidden meaning, some clue between the lines that might explain this vanishing act of ink and memory. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows of her father's study, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The room, usually a sanctuary of leather-bound books and the comforting scent of old paper and pipe tobacco, felt alien, charged with an unsettling energy. Her father, a prominent lawyer with connections that reached even into the shadowy corners of the War Department, was away on business in Washington. He'd left her in charge of the house, a sprawling brownstone on the Upper East Side, and the few remaining staff a skeleton crew compared to their usual retinue, thanks to the war effort. Most of the younger men had been drafted, or had volunteered, caught up in the patriotic fervor that had swept the nation. Felicia traced the fading signature with a trembling finger. Martin. He'd been so vibrant. Tall, with eyes the color of a stormy sea, and a smile that could chase away the shadows, even in a world teetering on the brink of collapse. He'd been attached to her sister, Clara, by the hip for most of the evening, a courtship dance orchestrated by their families. Clara, with her golden hair and porcelain skin, was the undisputed belle of their social circle, destined for a brilliant match. Martin, with his family's old money and impeccable lineage, was deemed a suitable prospect. But it was Felicia who had found herself drawn to him, to the quiet intensity that simmered beneath his polished exterior. They'd shared a brief conversation on the terrace, overlooking the manicured gardens, the distant sounds of the city a muted hum against the backdrop of their words. He'd spoken of his hopes for the future, of his belief in a world beyond the trenches, a world where art and music and laughter could flourish again. He'd spoken of his passion for photography, of his desire to capture the beauty of the world, even amidst the ugliness of war. She'd felt a connection with him, a spark of understanding that transcended the polite formalities of their social circles. It was a connection that had been abruptly severed by his departure, leaving behind only this fading echo of a man. Felicia carefully placed the letter back on the desk, the disappearing ink a stark reminder of the fragility of life, the ephemeral nature of memory. She walked over to the window, gazing out at the bustling street below. Carriages and motor cars jostled for space, their horns blaring a discordant symphony. Pedestrians hurried along the sidewalks, their faces etched with a mixture of anxiety and determination. The war felt distant, yet it permeated everything, a subtle undercurrent of fear that colored even the brightest of days. She'd received other letters from soldiers, from friends and family members serving overseas. They were filled with the same carefully constructed optimism, the same brave pronouncements of duty and sacrifice. But none of them had exhibited this strange phenomenon. It was as if Martin Ellis was being erased, not just from the paper but from existence itself. A cold shiver ran down her spine. She knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that something was terribly wrong. It wasn't just the disappearing ink, it was the feeling, the intuition that gnawed at her, a sense of impending doom that she couldn't shake. She thought of her father, with his network of contacts, his ability to navigate the labyrinthine corridors of power. He would know what to do, but he was unreachable, lost in the bureaucratic maze of Washington. She was alone, with this unsettling mystery, this fading letter, and a growing sense of unease. Felicia turned away from the window, her gaze falling back on the letter. The S in Ellis was now barely visible, a faint whisper of gray. She had to do something. She couldn't just sit here and watch as Martin Ellis vanished completely. She had to find out what was happening, even if it meant venturing into the shadows, into the hidden world that lay beneath the surface of polite society and patriotic pronouncements. She owed it to him, to the memory of that brief, stolen conversation, to the spark of connection that had flickered between them. She owed it to herself. She picked up a small, leather-bound address book from her desk, flipping through the pages until she found the entry she was looking for. Mr. Alastair Finch, a private investigator her father had used on occasion for discreet inquiries. He was known for his unconventional methods and his uncanny ability to uncover the truth, no matter how deeply buried. He was also known for his discretion, a quality that was paramount in these uncertain times. Felicia reached for the telephone, her hand trembling slightly. As she dialed the number, she glanced back at the letter. The signature was almost completely gone now, a ghostly reminder of a man who was slipping away, fading into the mists of a war that threatened to consume them all. She knew there is a greater storm at bay. Chapter 2. Whispers across the Atlantic. The receiver felt cold and heavy in Felicia's hand as she waited for Alastair Finch to answer. The rhythmic clicking of the telephone exchange echoed the frantic beat of her heart. Each click was a tiny hammer blow against the fragile edifice of her composure. Finally, a gruff voice crackled through the line. "Finch here. Mr. Finch, this is Felicia Wright. My father, Arthur Wright, has employed your services in the past." She kept her voice steady, projecting an air of calm authority that belied the turmoil within. There was a pause, a rustling sound as if Finch was consulting a ledger or a file. "Right, yes, I recall. A delicate matter concerning a misplaced heirloom, if memory serves." Felicia winced inwardly. The misplaced heirloom had been a rather scandalous affair involving a stolen necklace and a philandering politician. Her father had managed to keep the whole thing out of the papers, thanks to Finch's discretion. "Yes, that's correct. I have a matter of a similarly sensitive nature that I require your assistance with." "And what might that be, Miss Wright?" Finch's voice was devoid of inflection, a professional blank slate. Felicia hesitated, unsure how to explain the bizarre phenomenon of the disappearing ink. It sounded preposterous, even to her own ears. "It concerns a letter," she began, choosing her words carefully. "A letter from a soldier serving in France. Corporal Martin Ellis." "A soldier, you say?" Finch's tone sharpened slightly, a hint of interest creeping into his voice. "Is he missing? Wounded?" "Not exactly," Felicia said, struggling to find the right words. "The letter itself is changing. The ink is fading. Disappearing." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Felicia could almost hear the gears turning in Finch's mind, weighing the credibility of her claim. "Disappearing, you say? Like invisible ink?" "No, not like invisible ink," Felicia insisted. "It was perfectly legible when I received it. But now it's as if he's being erased." Another silence, longer this time. Felicia could picture Finch, a man of medium height with a sharp, hawkish face and eyes that seemed to see everything, sitting in his dimly lit office, surrounded by stacks of files and the lingering scent of stale cigar smoke. "And you believe this phenomenon is connected to Corporal Ellis's well-being?" Finch finally asked. "I do," Felicia said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. "I know it sounds illogical, but I have a feeling, a very strong feeling, that something is terribly wrong." Finch sighed, a sound that conveyed a mixture of skepticism and reluctant curiosity. "Very well, Miss Wright. I'll look into it." Bring the letter to my office tomorrow morning.
10 o'clock sharp.
And be prepared to answer some questions. Thank you, Mr. Finch, Felicia said, relief flooding through her. I appreciate your willingness to consider this. Don't thank me yet, Miss Wright, Finch said dryly. I haven't agreed to take the case. I'm merely agreeing to investigate. The truth, as they say, is often stranger than fiction. But it's rarely convenient. The line went dead. Felicia slowly replaced the receiver, her mind racing. Finch's words, stranger than fiction, echoed in her thoughts. She glanced at the letter on her desk, now a blank sheet of paper except for the faintest impression of where Martin's signature had once been. It was as if he had never existed, never written those words, never shared that brief, poignant moment with her on the terrace. The thought sent a fresh wave of fear through her. She had to find out what was happening, not just for Martin, but for herself. She felt a growing sense of responsibility, a need to unravel this mystery, to hold onto the fading memory of a man she barely knew, but who had somehow touched her life in a profound way. The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity. She oversaw the household duties, trying to maintain an air of normalcy for the sake of the staff. She wrote a carefully worded letter to her father, informing him of her decision to consult with Finch, omitting the more fantastical details of the disappearing ink. She knew he would be concerned, perhaps even dismissive, but she couldn't wait for his return. Time was of the essence. As evening approached, Felicia found herself drawn back to her father's study. The room was shrouded in shadows, the only light emanating from a single lamp on the desk. The blank letter lay where she had left it, a silent testament to the mystery that consumed her. She picked up the letter, holding it up to the light, searching for any trace of the vanished words. Nothing. It was as if they had been swallowed by the paper itself, absorbed into the very fabric of its being. She remembered Martin's words about photography, about capturing the beauty of the world, even amidst the ugliness of war. She wondered if he had managed to take any photographs before whatever had happened to him. Perhaps there was a clue there, a visual record of his life, his experiences, that might shed some light on his disappearance. The thought sparked a flicker of hope in the darkness. She knew it was a long shot, but she had to pursue every avenue, every possibility. She had to find a way to bring Martin Ellis back, to restore his signature, to reclaim his memory from the encroaching shadows. The weight of transatlantic whispers, secrets hidden between continents, settled upon her, but determination solidified her resolve. Chapter 3. The Society of Fading Echoes. 10 o'clock the following morning found Felicia standing before a nondescript door on a narrow, cobbled street in Lower Manhattan. The only indication of its occupant was a small, tarnished brass plate that read simply, A. Finch Inquiries. The building itself was old and weathered, its brick facade stained with the grime of decades, a silent witness to the city's ever-shifting fortunes. It was a far cry from the elegant brownstones of the Upper East Side, a world apart from Felicia's privileged existence. She took a deep breath, steeling her nerves, and knocked. The door opened almost immediately, revealing a dimly lit hallway that smelled of dust and old paper. Alastair Finch stood in the doorway, his sharp eyes scrutinizing her from head to toe. He was dressed in a rumpled tweed suit, his tie slightly askew, his hair a mess of unruly gray. He looked as if he hadn't slept in days. "Miss Wright," he said, his voice a low growl. "You're punctual. I appreciate that." He stepped aside, gesturing for her to enter. Felicia stepped inside, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. The office was small and cluttered, crammed with overflowing bookshelves, stacks of files, and a large, cluttered desk that dominated the room. A single window, covered with a grimy film, offered a limited view of the street outside. The air was thick with the scent of stale tobacco and something else, something indefinable, that hinted at secrets and hidden knowledge. "Please have a seat," Finch said, gesturing towards a worn leather armchair in front of the desk. Felicia sat down, carefully placing the blank letter on the desk between them. Finch remained standing, his gaze fixed on the letter, his expression unreadable. You say this letter was written by Corporal Ellis just 3 weeks ago? He asked, his voice devoid of inflection. Yes, Felicia confirmed. I received it myself. The signature was perfectly clear. And then it began to fade. Finch picked up the letter, holding it up to the light, his eyes narrowed in concentration. He turned it over, examining the back, running his fingers over the paper as if searching for some hidden clue. There's no trace of ink, he said, his voice a low murmur. It's as if it was never there. Exactly, Felicia said, her voice tinged with frustration. That's what I've been trying to tell you. It's unnatural. Finch lowered the letter, his gaze shifting to Felicia. Unnatural, perhaps, he said, but not necessarily supernatural. There are many things in this world that defy easy explanation, Miss Wright, especially in times of war. He walked over to a filing cabinet, pulling out a thick folder. He flipped through the pages, his brow furrowed in concentration. I've been doing some preliminary research on Corporal Ellis, he said, his voice muffled by the papers. He was attached to the 308th Infantry Regiment, 77th Division. They saw heavy fighting in the Argonne Forest. Felicia felt a knot tighten in her stomach. The Argonne Forest. She'd read about it in the newspapers, the horrific accounts of trench warfare, the staggering casualties. It was a place of death and destruction, a landscape scarred by the ravages of war. He was a photographer before the war, Felicia said, remembering their conversation on the terrace. He mentioned wanting to document the beauty, even amidst the ugliness. Finch looked up, a flicker of interest in his eyes. A photographer, you say? That's interesting. He pulled out a sheet of paper from the folder, scanning it quickly. There's no mention of that in his official records. But there is a note here, a rather cryptic one. It says, subject possesses unusual sensitivities. Recommended for special observation. Felicia frowned. Special observation? What does that mean? Finch shrugged. It could mean anything, Miss Wright. It could be a reference to his photographic skills. Or, it could be something else entirely. The military is fond of euphemisms, especially when it comes to matters of intelligence. He closed the folder, placing it on the desk. I've also discovered something else, Miss Wright. Something that might interest you. There's a group, a rather clandestine society, operating in this city. They call themselves the Society of Fading Echoes. Felicia stared at him, her mind reeling. The Society of what? Fading Echoes, Finch repeated. They're a group of individuals who claim to have a connection to the other side. To the spirits of the dead. Or, in some cases, the disappearing. Felicia felt a chill run down her spine. And you think Martin is connected to this society? Finch leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on Felicia.
I don't know, Miss Wright.
But it's a possibility. A possibility that we need to explore. This society, they're known for their secrecy, their rituals, their unorthodox methods. They're also known to be involved in espionage. Gathering information, spreading disinformation, manipulating events from the shadows. Espionage? Felicia whispered, her voice barely audible.
But why?
What would they want with Martin? That, Miss Wright, Finch said, his voice a low growl, is what we need to find out. And I have a feeling that the answer lies buried deep within the heart of this society. Within the whispers of the fading echoes. A sudden, sharp rap on the door broke the tense silence, leaving Felicia with a cliffhanger. Chapter 4. A rendezvous in Gramercy Park. The sharp rap on the door startled Felicia, making her jump in her seat. Finch, however, remained unfazed, his expression unchanged. He simply raised an eyebrow, a silent question directed at the unseen visitor. Enter, he called out, his voice a low rumble. The door opened, revealing a young woman standing in the hallway. She was dressed in a simple, dark dress, her hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and anxious. She looked to be about Felicia's age, but there was a weariness in her expression that hinted at a life lived under duress. Mr. Finch, she said, her voice trembling slightly. I have information about the society. Finch gestured for her to enter. Come in, Miss Davies. This is Miss Wright. She's assisting me with this investigation. The young woman, Miss Davies, stepped inside, her gaze flickering nervously between Finch and Felicia. She clutched a small, worn book in her hands, her knuckles white with tension. "I overheard them talking," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "They're planning a meeting. Tonight. In Gramercy Park." Felicia felt a surge of adrenaline. Gramercy Park. It was just a few blocks from her home, a private oasis of green in the heart of the city. She'd often strolled through its manicured gardens, admiring the stately brownstones that lined its perimeter. It was a place of beauty and tranquility, a world away from the grime and shadows of Finch's office. "A meeting?" Finch asked, his voice sharp and focused. "What kind of meeting?" I don't know," Miss Davies said, her voice shaking. "They were being secretive. But I heard them mention a name. Corporal Ellis." Felicia's heart leaped into her throat. Martin's name. It was the first concrete link they had, a tangible connection to the mystery of his disappearing signature. "Did they say anything else?" Finch pressed, his eyes narrowed in concentration. They spoke of a ritual," Miss Davies said, her voice barely audible. "A ritual to communicate with the other side. To bring someone back." Felicia felt a cold shiver run down her spine. A ritual. To bring someone back. It sounded dangerous, even desperate. "And where, exactly, in Gramercy Park is this meeting taking place?" Finch asked, his voice a low growl. Miss Davies hesitated, her eyes darting nervously around the room. "By the statue of Edwin Booth," she said, her voice trembling. "At midnight." Edwin Booth. The famous actor, brother of the infamous John Wilkes Booth. His statue, a bronze figure in a dramatic pose, stood in the center of the park, a silent sentinel overlooking the manicured lawns and flower beds. "Thank you, Miss Davies," Finch said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "You've been very helpful. You can go now." Miss Davies nodded, relief flooding her face. She turned and hurried out of the office, closing the door behind her. Finch turned to Felicia, his expression grim. "Well, Miss Wright," he said, "it seems we have a rendezvous. Tonight. In Gramercy Park." Felicia met his gaze, her own determination hardening. "Yes," she said, her voice firm. "We do." The rest of the day passed in a haze of anticipation and anxiety. Felicia returned home, trying to maintain an air of normalcy, but her mind was racing. She couldn't shake the image of Miss Davies, her pale face and trembling hands, her whispered words about the Society of Fading Echoes and their clandestine meeting. She tried to focus on other things, on the mundane tasks of running a household, but her thoughts kept returning to Martin, to the mystery of his disappearing signature, to the looming rendezvous in Gramercy Park. As evening approached, she changed into a dark dress, a simple, unadorned garment that would allow her to blend in with the shadows. She slipped a small, silver locket around her neck, a gift from her mother, a tangible reminder of the life she was fighting to protect. Inside the locket was a miniature portrait of her father, a stern but loving face that gave her strength. She left the house quietly, slipping out the back entrance, avoiding the watchful eyes of the remaining staff. The streets were dark and deserted, the city holding its breath in anticipation of the night. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke. She walked quickly, her footsteps echoing on the empty sidewalks. As she approached Gramercy Park, she could see the faint glow of gas lamps illuminating the wrought iron gates. The park was closed to the public at night, its gates locked, its secrets guarded. But Felicia knew there were ways in, hidden entrances known only to those who frequented its shadows. She found a small, unlocked gate tucked away behind a row of overgrown bushes. She slipped inside, her heart pounding in her chest. The park was eerily silent, the only sound the rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze. The gas lamps cast long, dancing shadows, creating an atmosphere of mystery and suspense. She made her way towards the center of the park, towards the statue of Edwin Booth. As she drew closer, she could see a faint glow emanating from beneath the statue, a flickering light that hinted at a hidden gathering. She could hear the murmur of voices, low and indistinct, carrying on the night air. She crept closer, concealing herself behind a large oak tree, her eyes fixed on the scene before her. A small group of people, shrouded in darkness, were gathered around the base of the statue. They were chanting, their voices a low, rhythmic drone, their words unintelligible. In the center of the circle, a single candle flickered, casting an eerie glow on their faces. Felicia felt a surge of fear, but also a growing sense of determination. She had to find out what they were doing, what they knew about Martin. She had to get closer. As she took a tentative step forward, a hand suddenly clamped down on her shoulder, making her gasp in surprise. Before the scream fully formed in her throat, she found herself dragged back by the iron grip. Chapter 5. The Cipher of Lost Souls. Felicia struggled against the iron grip that held her, her heart pounding in her chest like a trapped bird. She tried to turn, to see who had grabbed her, but the hand on her shoulder tightened, preventing her from moving. Quiet, a voice hissed in her ear, a voice she recognized. Alistair Finch. He pulled her back further into the shadows, concealing them both behind the thick trunk of the oak tree. Felicia, her initial fear giving way to a surge of relief, leaned against the rough bark, trying to catch her breath. "What are you doing here?" she whispered, her voice still shaky. "I thought you were following you, of course," Finch whispered back, his voice a low growl. "I wouldn't let you walk into this alone. This society, they're dangerous. They're not to be trifled with." Felicia nodded, her gaze returning to the scene before them. The group of people were still chanting, their voices rising and falling in a hypnotic rhythm. The single candle flickered, casting eerie shadows on their faces, making them look like grotesque masks. "What are they doing?" she whispered, her eyes fixed on the ritual. "They're trying to communicate," Finch said, his voice barely audible. "With the other side. They believe they can channel the spirits of the dead. Or, in this case, the disappearing." Felicia watched as one of the figures, a tall, slender man dressed in a long, black robe, stepped forward. He raised his hands above his head, his voice rising in a crescendo. He held a small, leather-bound book, similar to the one Miss Davies had clutched in Finch's office. "That book," Felicia whispered. "What is it?" "It's a cipher," Finch said. "A book of coded messages. The Society uses it to communicate with their contacts across the Atlantic. In the war zone." Felicia felt a chill run down her spine. A cipher. Espionage. It was all starting to make sense, in a terrifying, twisted way. Martin, with his unusual sensitivities, his photographic skills, his connection to this society, he was a pawn in a much larger game, a game of secrets and lies, of hidden agendas and deadly consequences. The chanting reached a fever pitch, the voices blending together in a cacophony of sound. The robed figure opened the book, reading from its pages in a strange, guttural language. Felicia couldn't understand the words, but she could feel the power emanating from them, a dark, unsettling energy that filled the air. Suddenly, the candle flickered and died, plunging the scene into darkness. The chanting stopped abruptly, replaced by a stunned silence. Felicia held her breath, her eyes straining to see through the gloom. Then, a faint light appeared, a shimmering, ethereal glow that emanated from the base of the statue. The light grew stronger, illuminating the faces of the society members, their expressions a mixture of awe and terror. In the center of the light, a figure began to materialize, a ghostly apparition that took the shape of a man. Felicia gasped, her eyes widening in disbelief. It was Martin. He looked different. Pale and gaunt, his eyes hollow, his uniform torn and blood-stained. But it was him. She recognized his face, his features, the way he held his head. The robed figure stepped forward, addressing the apparition in a low, reverent voice.
"Corporal Ellis," he said.
"We have summoned you. We need your help." The apparition of Martin remained silent, his gaze fixed on the robed figure. He seemed distant, detached, as if he were struggling to comprehend his surroundings. "We know about the photographs," the robed figure continued. "The ones you took. The ones that reveal the truth." Felicia felt a jolt of understanding. The photographs. Martin's passion for photography, his desire to capture the reality of war. He had seen something, documented something that the society wanted. Something that threatened their plans. Where are they? The robed figure demanded, his voice hardening. Where did you hide them? The apparition of Martin remained silent for a moment, his gaze shifting, flickering around the circle. Then his eyes met Felicia's. She felt a shockwave of recognition, a connection that transcended the boundaries of life and death. He knew she was there. He could see her. He opened his mouth, as if to speak, but no sound came out. He struggled, his ghostly form flickering, fading. The robed figure grew impatient, raising his hand in a threatening gesture.
Tell us,
he shouted, or you will suffer the consequences. The apparition of Martin winced, his form shrinking, dissolving. He looked at Felicia again, his eyes filled with a desperate plea. Then, he vanished, the ethereal light fading away, leaving them in darkness once more. A sudden surge of movement from the society members broke Felicia's trance, leaving her gasping for air. Chapter 6. Beneath the Gilded Cage. The sudden disappearance of Martin's apparition sent a wave of panic through the gathered members of the Society of Fading Echoes. They began to murmur amongst themselves, their voices a mixture of fear and frustration. The robed figure, his face contorted with anger, slammed the cipher book shut.
He's gone,
he shouted. He slipped away before we could get the information. Finch, still holding Felicia firmly by the arm, pulled her further back into the shadows. We need to leave, he whispered urgently.
Now.
Before they discover us. Felicia nodded, her mind still reeling from what she had just witnessed. She had seen Martin, or at least a ghostly image of him. He had recognized her, had tried to communicate with her. But he had been too weak, too far gone. And now, he was gone again, vanished back into the ethereal realm from which he had come. They slipped away from the oak tree, moving silently through the darkness, their footsteps muffled by the soft grass. They reached the hidden gate, slipping out onto the deserted street. The city felt different now, charged with a sinister energy, the shadows deeper, the silence more profound. What was that? Felicia whispered, her voice trembling. Was that really him? It was an echo, Finch said, his voice grim. A remnant of his consciousness. Trapped between worlds. The society they're trying to exploit that. To extract information from him. Even in death. The photographs, Felicia said, her voice filled with a sudden realization. He was trying to tell me something about the photographs. Yes, Finch agreed. They're the key. To everything. We need to find them. Before the society does. They walked quickly, heading back towards Finch's office. The streets were empty, the only sound the occasional rumble of a passing motor car. Felicia felt a growing sense of urgency, a need to act quickly, to unravel this mystery before it was too late. But where do we start? She asked, her voice filled with frustration. Where could he have hidden them? Finch was silent for a moment, his brow furrowed in thought. He was a soldier, he said finally. He would have had limited options. Somewhere secure. Somewhere unexpected. He stopped abruptly, his eyes widening. The letters, he said. The ones he sent you.
Did you keep them?
Felicia's heart leaped.
Yes, she said.
I kept them all. Except for the one that disappeared. Bring them to my office, Finch said. Tomorrow morning. We need to examine them. There might be a clue there, a hidden message, something we've overlooked. They reached Finch's office. The dimly lit hallway a welcome refuge from the darkness outside. Finch unlocked the door, gesturing for Felicia to enter. Go home, Miss Wright, he said.
Get some rest.
You'll need it. This is just the beginning. Felicia nodded, her mind still racing. She thanked Finch, promising to return in the morning with the letters. She walked home slowly, her thoughts consumed by the events of the night. The image of Martin's ghostly apparition haunted her, his desperate plea, his fading form. She felt a profound sense of sadness, a deep ache for a man she barely knew, but who had somehow become the center of her world. She reached her home, the sprawling brownstone a silent, empty shell. The staff were asleep, the house shrouded in darkness. She slipped inside, locking the door behind her. She went to her father's study, the room where it had all begun, with the disappearing signature. She sat at the desk, staring at the blank space where the letter had once been. It was as if Martin had never existed, never written those words, never shared that brief, poignant moment with her. But she knew he had. She had seen him, heard him, felt his presence. And she wouldn't rest until she had found him, until she had uncovered the truth, until she had brought him justice. She went to her room, retrieving the small box where she kept the letters from Martin. She opened the box, her hands trembling. She took out the letters one by one, examining them carefully. They were filled with the same carefully worded optimism, the same brave pronouncements of duty and sacrifice. But there was something else, too, a subtle undercurrent of sadness, a hint of longing for a life beyond the trenches. She read through the letters again, searching for any clue, any hidden message, anything that might shed light on his disappearance. She found nothing. Frustrated, she was about to put the letters away when she noticed something. One of the envelopes, the one that had contained the second letter, was slightly thicker than the others. She held it up to the light, examining it closely. There was a faint bulge, a subtle distortion in the paper. She carefully opened the envelope, her heart pounding in her chest. Inside, tucked between the folds of the paper, she found a small, folded piece of photographic paper. She unfolded it, revealing a black and white photograph. The hidden compartment and the discovered photograph left her breathless. Chapter 7. The Serpent in the Ledger. Felicia's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the photograph. It was a small, grainy image, but the details were clear enough. It showed a group of men, dressed in military uniforms, standing in a muddy field. In the background, she could see the shattered remains of a building, smoke still rising from its ruins. The men were not American soldiers. Their uniforms were different, unfamiliar. German. But it wasn't the soldiers that drew her attention. It was the man standing in the center of the group, his face partially obscured by the shadow of his helmet. He was holding something in his hands, a small, rectangular object.
A book.
The cipher book. Felicia felt a jolt of recognition. It was the same book the robed figure had used during the ritual in Gramercy Park, the book Miss Davies had described, the book that contained the coded messages, the secrets of the Society of Fading Echoes. But there was something else, too. Something that sent a chill down her spine. Standing next to the man with the cipher book, partially hidden behind him, was another figure. A woman. Felicia recognized her immediately. It was her sister, Clara. Felicia stared at the photograph, her mind reeling. Clara. Her own sister. Involved with the enemy. Involved with the Society of Fading Echoes. It was unbelievable. Betrayal, stark and raw, twisted in her gut. She examined the photograph more closely, searching for any detail that might explain this impossible scenario. Clara looked different. Her usual bright, cheerful expression was gone, replaced by a look of cold determination. She was wearing a simple, dark dress, similar to the one Miss Davies had worn. Her hair was pulled back in a tight bun, her face pale and drawn. Felicia remembered her sister's engagement party, the night she had met Martin. Clara had been the center of attention, the radiant bride-to-be, surrounded by admirers. Martin had been attentive, courteous, the perfect gentleman. But Felicia had sensed a distance between them, a lack of genuine connection. Had Clara been playing a role, even then? Had she been using Martin, using her engagement as a cover for her other activities? Felicia felt a surge of anger, a burning resentment towards her sister. How could she betray her country, her family, her fiancé? She looked at the photograph again, focusing on the man with the cipher book. He was tall and slender, his features sharp and angular. There was something familiar about him, something that tugged at the edges of her memory. She realized, with a sudden shock of recognition, that she had seen him before. At the engagement party. He had been one of the guests, a distant acquaintance of her father's, a man named Schmidt. He had been introduced as a businessman, a representative of a German trading company. Felicia remembered him now, his quiet demeanor, his watchful eyes, the way he had seemed to observe everything, to miss nothing. He had spoken to Clara, briefly, in a hushed conversation that Felicia had dismissed at the time as mere social pleasantries. But now, she saw it in a different light. It had been a clandestine meeting, an exchange of information, a conspiracy unfolding right under her nose. Felicia felt a growing sense of dread. This was bigger than she had imagined, more complex, more dangerous. It wasn't just about Martin's disappearance. It was about espionage, about betrayal, about a secret war being waged in the shadows, a war that threatened to engulf her entire world. She knew she had to show the photograph to Finch. He would know what to do, how to interpret its meaning, how to unravel the tangled web of deceit that surrounded her. She carefully placed the photograph back in the envelope, tucking it safely away in her pocket. She went to bed, but sleep eluded her. Her mind was racing, her thoughts a chaotic jumble of images and emotions. She tossed and turned, haunted by the photograph, by the image of her sister, by the realization that she was caught in a web of intrigue that stretched far beyond her comprehension. The next morning, she rose early, her eyes heavy, her body exhausted. She dressed quickly, grabbing the letters and the photograph, and hurried to Finch's office. She found him already there, his desk cluttered with papers, his face etched with concern. He looked up as she entered, his eyes widening as he saw her expression. "What is it?" he asked, his voice sharp. "What have you found?" Felicia placed the photograph on the desk between them. "Look," she said, her voice trembling. "Look at this." Finch picked up the photograph, his eyes narrowing as he examined it. He recognized the cipher book immediately, his expression hardening. He saw Clara, his eyes widening in surprise. He saw her Schmidt, his face turning pale. This changes everything," he said, his voice a low growl. "This is bigger than we thought. Much bigger." He looked at Felicia, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and determination. "We need to be careful, Miss Wright," he said. "Very careful. We're dealing with powerful forces. Forces that will stop at nothing to protect their secrets." The discovery set their next course, the ledger of names belonging to the society. Chapter 8. Shadows of the Lusitania. Finch leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the photograph, his mind racing. The image of Clara standing beside a known German agent, the cipher book a silent testament to their treachery, had shaken him to his core. This was no longer just a missing person case, it was a full-blown espionage investigation, with implications that reached far beyond the confines of New York City. "We need to find out what Clara's role is in all of this," he said, his voice grim. "And what her Schmidt's connection is to the Society of Fading Echoes." Felicia nodded, her own anxiety growing. She felt a mixture of betrayal and fear, a sense of dread that settled like a lead weight in her stomach. Her own sister, a spy. It was unthinkable. "I don't understand," she said, her voice trembling. "Why would Clara do this? What could possibly motivate her?" Finch sighed, running a hand through his already disheveled hair. "Money? Ideology? Blackmail? There are many possibilities, Miss Wright. We can't rule anything out." He picked up the photograph again, examining it closely. This photograph, it was taken in France, near the front lines. That means Clara was actively involved in the war effort. Not as a nurse or a volunteer, but as an operative. Felicia remembered the newspaper accounts of the sinking of the Lusitania, the passenger liner torpedoed by a German U-boat, killing over 1,000 civilians, including many Americans. The event had shocked the world, fueling anti-German sentiment and pushing the United States closer to entering the war. Could Clara have been involved? She whispered, her voice barely audible. "In the Lusitania?" Finch's expression darkened. "It's possible," he said, his voice heavy. "The Society of Fading Echoes, they're known for their ruthlessness, their willingness to use any means necessary to achieve their goals. They wouldn't hesitate to sacrifice innocent lives to further their cause." Felicia felt a wave of nausea, a sickening realization of the depths of her sister's depravity. If Clara had been involved in the sinking of the Lusitania, she was responsible for the deaths of hundreds, perhaps thousands, of innocent people. We need to find proof, Felicia said, her voice hardening. We need to expose her. Expose them all. We will, Finch said, his voice filled with determination. But we need to be strategic. We can't confront Clara directly.
Not yet.
She's too deeply embedded. She'll deny everything, and we'll lose our leverage. He paused, his gaze shifting to the cipher book in the photograph. The ledger, he said. The one Miss Davies mentioned. The list of names. That's our next target. If we can get our hands on that, we can expose the entire network. We can bring them all down. But where is it? Felicia asked, her voice filled with frustration. How do we find it? Finch was silent for a moment, his brow furrowed in thought. Herr Schmidt, he said finally. He's the key. He's the one who controls the cipher book, the one who coordinates the Society's activities in New York. He's the one who knows where the ledger is. But how do we find him? Felicia asked. He's a ghost. He disappears and reappears at will. Not entirely, Finch said, a flicker of a smile playing on his lips. He has a weakness. A fondness for the finer things in life. He frequents certain establishments. Clubs, restaurants, social gatherings. Places where the wealthy and powerful congregate. He reached for a small, leather-bound notebook, flipping through its pages. I have a contact, he said. Someone who moves in those circles. Someone who might be able to point us in the right direction. He found a name and address that was written with bold ink strokes. A Mr. Silas Blackwood, he announced, a man known for having his ear to the ground. If anyone knows Schmidt's movements, it is Blackwood. He copied the details on a sheet from the notebook. Meet me there at 9. I'll see what Blackwood has to offer, Finch commanded, his voice returning to the flat growl that was more familiar. He rose to show Felicia out. Felicia agreed and departed, taking the paper, her own planning already underway. The shadows of the Lusitania lengthened in her mind, a grim reminder of the stakes, a chilling premonition of the dangers that lay ahead. The weight of her sister's possible involvement in such a horrific tragedy fueled her determination, but also cast a long, dark shadow over her heart. Chapter 9. The Clockmaker's Secret. 9 o'clock that evening found Felicia standing outside a discreet, unmarked door on a quiet side street in Greenwich Village. The building was old and unassuming, its facade unremarkable, its windows dark and shuttered. Only a faint glow emanating from beneath the door hinted at the activity within. This was the address Finch had given her, the location of Mr. Silas Blackwood's establishment. She hesitated for a moment, her hand hovering over the doorknob. She was entering a world she knew little about, a world of shadows and secrets, of hidden agendas and dangerous liaisons. But she couldn't turn back. Not now. Too much was at stake. She took a deep breath, steeling her nerves, and opened the door. She stepped inside, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. The room was small and intimate, furnished with plush velvet chairs, antique tables, and a large, ornate bar that dominated one wall. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cigars, fine wine, and something else, something indefinable, that hinted at intrigue and illicit affairs. A handful of people were scattered around the room, engaged in hushed conversations, their faces partially obscured by the shadows. They were dressed in elegant attire, their clothes and jewelry a testament to their wealth and status. Felicia felt a pang of unease, a sense of being out of place. She was an outsider in this world, a stranger in a strange land. She spotted Finch sitting at a small table in a secluded corner, his back to the wall, his eyes scanning the room. He was nursing a glass of amber liquid, his expression unreadable. He saw her and gestured for her to join him. Felicia made her way across the room, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. She sat down opposite Finch, her heart pounding in her chest. "Did you find him?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Finch nodded, his gaze fixed on a man standing at the bar, his back to them. He was tall and slender, dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, his dark hair slicked back, his posture elegant. "That's him," Finch said, his voice a low growl. Silas Blackwood. He's well connected. He knows everyone. And everyone knows him. Blackwood turned, his gaze sweeping across the room. He was handsome, with sharp features and piercing blue eyes that seemed to see everything. He caught Finch's eye, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. He nodded subtly, then turned back to the bar, resuming his conversation with the bartender. He knows we're here, Finch said. He'll approach us when he's ready. They waited in silence, the tension in the room palpable. Felicia sipped at a glass of water, trying to calm her nerves. She watched Blackwood, studying his movements, his interactions, trying to glean some insight into his character. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Blackwood finished his drink, paid the bartender, and walked towards their table. He moved with a grace and confidence that bespoke power and influence. Mr. Finch, he said, his voice smooth and cultured. A pleasure to see you again. He turned to Felicia, his eyes lingering on her face. And this must be Miss Wright. Indeed, Finch said. Miss Wright is assisting me with a delicate matter. Blackwood raised an eyebrow, a hint of amusement in his eyes. Delicate, you say?
I'm intrigued.
He sat down at the table, his gaze shifting between Finch and Felicia.
So, he said.
What can I do for you? Finch leaned forward, his voice low and confidential. We're looking for someone, he said. A man named Herr Schmidt. Blackwood's expression didn't change, but Felicia noticed a slight tightening of his jaw, a subtle flicker of tension in his eyes. Schmidt, he said, his voice neutral. A businessman, I believe. German. He's more than just a businessman, Finch said. He's involved in other activities. Activities that are of interest to us. And us meaning? Blackwood inquired. Let us say concern citizens with an interest in national security. Finch replied evenly. Blackwood was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on Finch. I see, he said finally. And what makes you think I can help you? You know everyone, Silas, Finch said. You have your sources. You hear things. Blackwood smiled, a thin, knowing smile. I do have a certain reputation, he said. But information comes at a price. We're prepared to pay, Finch said. Within reason. Blackwood leaned back in his chair, his gaze shifting to Felicia. And what is Miss Wright's interest in all of this? He asked. Felicia met his gaze, her own determination hardening. Herr Schmidt is connected to someone I know, she said. Someone who is involved in his activities. Blackwood raised an eyebrow, his eyes gleaming with curiosity. Intriguing, he said. A personal connection. That complicates things. He paused, his gaze returning to Finch. Very well, he said. I might be able to help you. But it will take time. And it will be expensive. We understand, Finch said. Tell us what you know. Blackwood leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. Schmidt, he's a creature of habit, he said. He frequents certain establishments. One in particular. A clock shop. In the Lower East Side. A clock shop? Felicia frowned. It seemed incongruous. Why would a German spy be frequenting a clock shop? A clock shop? Finch asked, his voice mirroring Felicia's surprise. Blackwood nodded. It's a front, he said. For something else. Something hidden. Something dangerous. The proprietor, a man by the unusual name of TikTok Tom, held court over it. What's hidden? Felicia pressed. The ledger is there. Kept in a safe behind a wall of clocks. TikTok Tom only opens it under orders from the highest levels. Blackwood responded, cryptic, with no further details, leaving the ledger's secrets hanging in the air. Chapter 10. A Ballroom of Broken Vows. The revelation of the clock shop as a front, and the ledger's hidden location, sent a jolt of both excitement and trepidation through Felicia. A seemingly innocuous business, a purveyor of time, concealing a network of spies and their secrets. It was a scene straight out of a dime novel, yet it was her reality. Tick-tock Tom, Finch mused, repeating the name with a hint of disbelief. Sounds eccentric. Eccentric, perhaps, Blackwood said, his voice a low murmur. But also dangerous. He's fiercely loyal to Schmidt. And he's not afraid to use force. We'll be careful, Finch assured him. But we need to get our hands on that ledger. It's the only way to expose them. Blackwood nodded. I understand. I'll make some inquiries. See if I can find out more about Schmidt's movements. When he's likely to be at the clock shop. Thank you, Silas, Finch said. We appreciate your assistance. Blackwood smiled, a thin, knowing smile. Don't mention it, Mr. Finch. It's always a pleasure to assist in matters of national security. He rose from his chair. I'll be in touch. He nodded to Felicia, his eyes lingering on her face for a moment, then turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Finch turned to Felicia, his expression grim. We're getting closer, he said. But we're also entering dangerous territory. We need to be prepared for anything. Felicia nodded, her own anxiety growing. She felt a sense of unease, a premonition of danger. But she couldn't back down. Not now. She had to see this through, to the end. They left the establishment, stepping out into the cool night air. The city felt different now, more menacing, the shadows deeper, the silence more profound. What do we do now? Felicia asked, her voice barely a whisper. We wait, Finch said. We wait for Blackwood to contact us. And then we make our move. The next few days passed in a haze of anticipation and anxiety. Felicia tried to focus on other things, on the mundane tasks of running a household, but her mind was racing. She kept replaying the conversation with Blackwood, analyzing every word, every gesture, searching for any hidden meaning. She also found herself thinking about Clara, about her sister's betrayal, about the photograph that had shattered her world. She couldn't reconcile the image of her sister, the bright, cheerful girl she had grown up with the cold, calculating spy she had become. She received a letter from her father, a brief, formal note informing her that he would be returning to New York soon. She dreaded his return, knowing that she would have to confess everything, reveal the truth about Clara, expose the family to scandal and disgrace. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Finch contacted her. Blackwood had provided information. Schmidt was scheduled to be at the clock shop the following evening. It was their chance. Felicia met Finch at a prearranged location, a quiet, deserted street near the clock shop. The Lower East Side was a world apart from her own, a maze of narrow, winding streets, teeming with immigrants, a melting pot of cultures and languages. The air was thick with the scent of spices, cooking food, and something else, something indefinable, that hinted at poverty and desperation. They approached the clock shop cautiously, their footsteps echoing on the empty sidewalks. The shop was small and unassuming, its windows filled with a display of clocks of all shapes and sizes, their hands frozen at different times. A single lamp illuminated the interior, casting an eerie glow on the ticking timepieces. Finch peered through the window, his eyes scanning the interior. He's there, he said, his voice a low growl.
Schmidt.
And tick-tock Tom. Felicia's heart pounded in her chest. This was it. The moment of truth. What's the plan? She whispered, her voice barely audible. Finch drew a small, silver pistol from his coat pocket. We go in, he said. We get the ledger. And we get out.
Quickly.
The ballroom of broken vows began in that dimly lit room, with the promise to retrieve what was stolen. He didn't wait for her response, not that she could form. He turned the doorknob, pushing the door open. The chime above the entry was like a wedding bell. And with that, the music started. Chapter 11. The Raven's Prophecy. The chime above the door, a discordant jangle in the tense silence, announced their arrival. Inside, the clock shop was a surreal tableau of ticking time. Hundreds of clocks, of every conceivable size and design, lined the walls, their hands moving in a chaotic, unsynchronized dance. The air was thick with a rhythmic tick-tock, a relentless pulse that amplified the tension. Behind the counter, a man with a wild shock of white hair and a magnifying glass strapped to his eye looked up, startled. This had to be Tick-Tock Tom. His eyes, magnified to an unsettling size, darted between Finch and Felicia. He looked like a mad scientist, a character ripped from the pages of a Gothic novel. At a small table in the back, partially obscured by a grandfather clock, sat a Schmidt. He was dressed in his usual impeccable suit, his face pale and drawn. He looked up, his eyes widening in surprise and then, quickly, hardening with suspicion. "Mr. Finch," Schmidt said, his voice smooth but laced with a hint of steel. "And Miss Wright. What an unexpected pleasure." "We're here for the ledger." "Schmidt," Finch said, his voice cold and devoid of emotion. He held the pistol loosely at his side, not pointing it directly at Schmidt, but making its presence known. Schmidt's eyes flickered to the pistol, then back to Finch. A faint smile played on his lips. "The ledger?"
he said.
"I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't play games with us, Schmidt," Finch growled. "We know about the Society of Fading Echoes. We know about your activities." Tick-Tock Tom, who had been silently observing the exchange, reached slowly beneath the counter. Felicia tensed, her eyes fixed on his hand. "I wouldn't do that, Tom," Finch said, his voice sharp. "Unless you want to join your clocks in permanent stillness." Tick-Tock Tom froze, his hand hovering beneath the counter. He glared at Finch, his magnified eyes burning with hatred. Schmidt sighed, his composure slipping slightly. "Very well, Mr. Finch," he said. "You leave me no choice." He reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a small, silver whistle. He put it to his lips and blew. The sound was shrill, piercing, almost unbearable. Felicia clapped her hands over her ears, her head throbbing. Suddenly, the clocks in the shop began to chime, all at once, a deafening cacophony of sound. The walls seemed to vibrate, the air to shimmer. Felicia felt a wave of dizziness, a sense of disorientation. From the back of the shop, from behind the grandfather clock, a figure emerged. It was a woman, tall and slender, dressed in a long, black dress. Felicia recognized her immediately. It was Clara. Felicia stared at her sister, her mind reeling. Clara. Here. With Schmidt. It was a nightmare come to life. Clara's face was pale and drawn, her eyes cold and devoid of emotion. She held a small, silver pistol in her hand, pointing it directly at Felicia. "Hello, sister," Clara said, her voice flat and devoid of warmth. "I see you've been busy." Felicia felt a surge of anger, a burning resentment towards her sister. "Clara," she said, her voice trembling. "What are you doing? Why are you doing this?" Clara ignored her question, her gaze fixed on Finch. "Drop the gun, Mr. Finch," she said. "Or I'll shoot." Finch hesitated, his eyes darting between Clara and Schmidt. He was outnumbered, outgunned. He slowly lowered his pistol, placing it on the counter. "Wise choice," Schmidt said, his voice smug. He turned to Clara. "Take Miss right to the back room," he said. "We'll deal with her later." Clara nodded, her gaze never leaving Felicia. She gestured with the pistol. "Move," she said. Felicia, her mind racing, her heart pounding, slowly backed away, moving towards the back of the shop, towards the grandfather clock. Clara followed her, her pistol trained on her back. As Felicia passed the grandfather clock, she noticed something. A small, black feather was lying on the floor, near the base of the clock. It looked like a raven's feather. She remembered the stories her grandmother used to tell her, the old folklore about ravens, the birds of ill omen, the messengers of death. A chill ran down her spine. Clara pushed her through a narrow doorway into a small, dimly lit room. The room was cluttered with clock parts, tools, and discarded mechanisms. A single bare bulb hung from the ceiling, casting an eerie glow on the dusty surfaces. In the center of the room, there was a large, iron safe, its door slightly ajar. Felicia could see the edge of a leather-bound book inside. The ledger. The Raven's Prophecy, Felicia whispered to herself as she found the strength to lunge at Clara. Chapter 12. The Price of Silence. Felicia's sudden lunge caught Clara off guard. The silver pistol, moments before pointed with deadly intent, wavered as Felicia slammed into her sister, knocking her back against a workbench cluttered with clock parts. The air whooshed from Clara's lungs in a surprised gasp. The pistol clattered to the floor, spinning away across the dusty concrete. "You!" Clara sputtered, struggling to regain her breath and her balance. Her eyes, usually so carefully composed, blazed with a mixture of shock and fury. Felicia didn't hesitate. She grabbed a heavy brass clock weight from the workbench, its smooth, cold surface fitting surprisingly well in her hand. It wasn't a weapon she'd ever imagined wielding, but desperation lent her strength. "Why, Clara?" Felicia demanded, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and heartbreak. "Why are you doing this? Why are you betraying your country, your family, me?" Clara pushed herself upright, her face contorted with rage. "You wouldn't understand," she hissed. "You've always been so naive, so sheltered. You have no idea what the real world is like." "The real world?" Felicia retorted. "Is that what you call this? Treachery? Espionage? Working with the enemy?" "The world is changing, Felicia," Clara said, her voice regaining its composure, becoming chillingly calm. "Old allegiances are meaningless. New powers are rising. And I choose to be on the winning side." "The winning side?" Felicia echoed, her voice laced with disbelief. "The side that sinks passenger ships? That kills innocent people?" Clara's eyes narrowed. "Collateral damage," she said dismissively. "A necessary price for progress." Felicia felt a surge of disgust. She couldn't believe this was her sister, the girl she had grown up with, the girl she had shared secrets and dreams with. This cold, calculating woman was a stranger. "Martin," Felicia said, her voice barely a whisper. "What did you do to him?" Clara's expression flickered for a moment, a hint of something that might have been regret crossing her face. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "He was a liability," she said, her voice flat. "He saw too much. He knew too much." "So you erased him?" Felicia said, her voice trembling with anger. "You used that society, that ritual, to silence him?" Clara didn't answer. She simply stared at Felicia, her eyes cold and unyielding. Felicia raised the clock weight, her hand shaking. She wanted to strike her, to hurt her, to make her pay for what she had done. But she couldn't. She couldn't bring herself to harm her own sister, no matter how much she deserved it. I pity you, Clara," Felicia said, her voice filled with sadness. "You've lost your soul. You've become a monster." She lowered the clock weight, her arm aching. She turned her attention to the safe, to the ledger that held the key to unraveling this conspiracy. She had to get it. She had to expose them all. She reached for the safe door, pulling it open. The ledger lay inside, its leather cover worn and faded. She reached for it, her fingers trembling. Suddenly, a shot rang out, the sound deafening in the small room. Felicia cried out, dropping the clock weight, her hand flying to her shoulder. She felt a searing pain, a burning sensation that spread through her arm. She staggered back, her vision blurring. She looked up, seeing Clara standing over her, the silver pistol, somehow retrieved, smoking in her hand. "I warned you," Clara said, her voice shaking. "I didn't want to do this. But you left me no choice." Her sister's actions set the price. Silence. Chapter 13. The telegram that tore the world. Felicia slumped against the workbench, clutching her wounded shoulder. The pain was intense, a throbbing ache that radiated down her arm. Blood seeped through her fingers, staining her dress a crimson red. She looked at Clara, her vision blurring, her mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. Her own sister had shot her. Clara stood over her, the pistol still in her hand, her face a mask of conflicting emotions. There was a flicker of something that might have been remorse, but it was quickly replaced by a cold, steely resolve. "I'm sorry, Felicia," Clara said, her voice barely a whisper.
"But you forced my hand."
Felicia wanted to scream, to lash out, to curse her sister for her betrayal. But the pain was too intense, the shock too overwhelming. She could only stare at Clara, her eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and despair. Suddenly, the door to the back room burst open, and Finch rushed in, his own pistol drawn. He took in the scene in an instant, his eyes widening in horror. "Felicia!" he cried, rushing to her side. He knelt beside her, examining her wound. "Damn it," he muttered. "She's losing blood." He turned to Clara, his face contorted with rage. You monster, he growled. What have you done? Clara didn't answer. She simply stood there, the pistol hanging limply in her hand, her gaze fixed on Felicia. Schmidt appeared in the doorway, his face pale and drawn. He looked at Felicia, then at Clara, his expression unreadable. What happened here? He asked, his voice trembling. She tried to stop me, Clara said, her voice barely audible. She was going to expose us. Schmidt's eyes narrowed. He looked at Finch, then back at Clara. We need to get out of here, he said.
Now.
Before the police arrive. He turned to TikTok Tom, who was standing in the doorway, his magnified eyes wide with alarm. Get the car ready, he ordered. We're leaving. TikTok Tom nodded and hurried away. Schmidt turned back to Clara.
Come, he said.
We're leaving you. Clara hesitated, her gaze lingering on Felicia. She opened her mouth as if to say something, but then closed it again. She turned and followed Schmidt out of the room, disappearing into the maze of ticking clocks. Finch ripped a strip of cloth from his shirt, pressing it against Felicia's wound, trying to staunch the flow of blood. Hold on, Felicia, he said, his voice urgent. I'll get you help. Felicia, her head swimming, her vision fading, could only nod weakly. She felt a growing sense of darkness, a cold, creeping numbness that spread through her body. Finch, supporting Felicia, managed to get her out of the clock shop and onto the street. The night air was cool against her feverish skin. She could hear the distant wail of sirens, growing closer. Finch flagged down a passing motorcar, explaining the situation to the driver. The driver, a young man with a kind face, agreed to take them to the nearest hospital. The ride to the hospital was a blur. Felicia drifted in and out of consciousness, her mind filled with fragmented images and distorted sounds. She saw Clara's face, her cold, unyielding eyes. She saw Martin's ghostly apparition, his desperate plea. She saw the photograph, the image of her sister standing beside a German agent. They arrived at the hospital, a large, imposing building that loomed over them like a fortress. Finch carried Felicia inside, shouting for help. Doctors and nurses rushed to their aid, placing Felicia on a stretcher, wheeling her away into a brightly lit operating room. Felicia lost consciousness. When she awoke, she was lying in a clean, white bed, her shoulder bandaged, her arm in a sling. The room was quiet, the only sound the gentle hum of machinery. Finch was sitting beside her bed, his face etched with concern. He looked up as she opened her eyes, relief flooding his face. Felicia, he said, his voice hoarse. You're awake. Thank God. What happened? Felicia asked, her voice weak and raspy. You were shot, Finch said. But you're going to be all right. The doctors, they removed the bullet. You lost a lot of blood, but you're stable. Clara, Felicia whispered. Where is she? Finch's expression darkened. She got away, he said. With Schmidt. They disappeared. Felicia felt a wave of despair. Clara, her own sister, a traitor, a fugitive. It was unbearable. The ledger, Felicia said, her voice barely audible. Did you get it? Finch shook his head. No, he said. It was gone. Schmidt must have taken it with him. Felicia closed her eyes, tears welling up. They had failed. They had lost everything. Suddenly, a nurse entered the room, holding a small, folded piece of paper. This was delivered for you, Miss Wright, she said, her voice hesitant. It had arrived just moments ago. Felicia, her heart pounding, reached out with her good hand, taking the paper. It was a telegram. She unfolded it, her hands trembling. She read the words, her eyes widening in disbelief. The telegram, delivered with perfect, cruel timing, tore her world apart. Regret to inform you Corporal Martin Ellis killed in action Argonne Forest. Stop. Details to follow. Stop. War Department. Chapter 14. The Ghost Train to Nowhere. The telegram slipped from Felicia's numb fingers, fluttering to the floor like a fallen leaf. The words, stark and brutal, echoed in her mind, a death knell for any lingering hope. Martin. Dead. Killed in action. It was impossible. She had seen him, spoken to him, felt his presence, even if it had been a ghostly echo. Finch picked up the telegram, his face paling as he read the words. He looked at Felicia, his eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and pity. "Felicia," he began, his voice faltering. "I don't know what to say." Felicia didn't respond. She simply stared at the ceiling, her mind numb, her heart shattered. The pain in her shoulder seemed insignificant compared to the gaping wound in her soul. Martin was gone, erased not by some mystical force, but by the brutal reality of war. The disappearing signature, the ghostly apparitions, the society of fading echoes, it had all been a distraction, a cruel illusion. The truth was far simpler, far more devastating. She had been chasing shadows, chasing a ghost, while the real enemy, the real threat, had been lurking in the background, waiting to strike. And now it had struck. The days that followed were a blur of grief and despair. Felicia remained in the hospital, recovering from her gunshot wound, but her physical healing was overshadowed by the emotional devastation she felt. Her father returned to New York, his face etched with concern and confusion. Felicia told him everything, the whole story, from the disappearing signature to Clara's betrayal to Martin's death. Her father listened in stunned silence, his world, like hers, crumbling around him. He tried to comfort her, to offer words of solace, but nothing could penetrate the wall of grief that surrounded her. She felt numb, empty, lost. The police launched an investigation into the Society of Fading Echoes, but with Schmidt and Clara gone and the ledger missing, their efforts were largely fruitless. The society, like a phantom, had vanished into thin air. Felicia was released from the hospital, returning to her empty home, a place that now felt haunted by memories and regrets. She tried to resume her life, to find some semblance of normalcy, but it was impossible. The world had changed irrevocably. One evening, a few weeks after her release, Finch came to visit her. He looked weary, defeated, his usual sharp demeanor softened by a profound sadness. I have some news," he said, his voice hesitant. "About Clara." Felicia looked up, her heart pounding. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Finch hesitated, his gaze shifting away. She was found," he said. "She and Schmidt. They were trying to leave the country. On a train." Felicia felt a flicker of hope, a desperate yearning for justice. "They were caught?" she asked. Finch shook his head. "No," he said, his voice heavy. "The train had derailed. There was an explosion. They were killed." Felicia stared at him, her mind struggling to comprehend his words. Clara, dead. Killed in a train wreck. It was a fitting end, perhaps, for a life of treachery and deceit. But it brought her no solace, no sense of closure. Only a deeper, more profound sense of loss. "It was the society," Finch said, his voice a low growl. "They eliminated them. To protect their secrets. To silence them forever." Felicia nodded, her eyes filling with tears. The Society of Fading Echoes, a shadowy organization that had manipulated and destroyed so many lives, had claimed its final victims. "And the ledger?" Felicia asked, her voice trembling. "Gone," Finch said. "Lost in the wreckage." "It's over, Felicia. It's all over." Felicia closed her eyes, letting the tears flow freely. It was over. The mystery, the intrigue, the chase, it had all ended in death and destruction. She was left with nothing but grief and regret, and the haunting memory of a man who had vanished, not once, but twice. She felt a sudden urge to escape, to leave the city, this house, this life behind. She needed to get away, to find some peace, some solace, somewhere far from the shadows of the past. I need to go," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I need to leave New York." Finch nodded, understanding. "Where will you go?" he asked. Felicia thought for a moment, her mind drifting back to the letters Martin had sent her, to his descriptions of the French countryside, to his dreams of a world beyond the trenches. "France," she said, her voice firm. "I'll go to France." She would go to the place where Martin had lived, where he had fought, where he had died. She would find his grave, she would honor his memory, She would try to find some meaning, some purpose, in the midst of all this loss. The train to nowhere ultimately led her there. Chapter 15. The Lighthouse Keeper's Vigil. Felicia arrived in France in the spring of 1918. The war was still raging, but the tide had begun to turn. American troops were pouring into the country, bolstering the Allied forces, pushing back the German advance. But the landscape was scarred, devastated by years of relentless fighting. Towns and villages lay in ruins, fields were churned into muddy wastelands, forests were reduced to skeletal remains. She traveled to the Argonne forest, the place where Martin had been killed. It was a haunting, desolate place, a vast expanse of shattered trees, shell craters, and abandoned trenches. The air was thick with the scent of decay, of death, of lingering sorrow. She searched for Martin's grave, but it was like searching for a needle in a haystack. There were thousands of graves, marked by simple wooden crosses, stretching as far as the eye could see. The names and numbers blurred together, a testament to the staggering loss of life. She spent days wandering through the cemeteries, reading the inscriptions, searching for any trace of Martin, any connection to the man she had known so briefly, but who had touched her life so profoundly. She found no grave. She found only a sea of anonymous crosses, a silent testament to the futility of war. Disheartened, but not defeated, Felicia decided to travel to the coast, to a small fishing village that Martin had mentioned in one of his letters. He had written about a lighthouse, a beacon of hope amidst the darkness, a place where he had found a moment of peace, a brief respite from the horrors of the front. She found the village, nestled in a sheltered cove, its whitewashed houses clinging to the rocky cliffs. The lighthouse stood on a promontory overlooking the sea, a tall, slender tower painted in bold stripes of red and white. She inquired about the lighthouse keeper, an old man named Pierre, who, she was told, had been there for decades, a silent witness to the ever-changing tides of the sea and of the war. She found Pierre at the base of the lighthouse, mending fishing nets, his weathered face etched with the lines of time and experience. He looked up as she approached, his eyes, the color of the sea, scrutinizing her with a mixture of curiosity and caution. Felicia explained her purpose, her connection to Martin, her search for his grave. Pierre listened in silence, his gaze fixed on her face, his expression unreadable. When she had finished, he nodded slowly. "Corporal Ellis," he said, his voice raspy with age. "I remember him. He came here often. He liked to photograph the lighthouse. He said it reminded him of home." Felicia felt a pang of emotion. Martin, finding solace in this remote place, seeking a connection to the life he had left behind. Did he ever talk about the war?" she asked, her voice hesitant.
Pierre nodded.
"He spoke of the horrors he had seen," he said, the futility of it all. He yearned for peace, for a world without violence. "He was a photographer," Felicia said. "Did he ever take any photographs here? Of the village? Of the lighthouse?" Pierre's expression changed, a flicker of something that might have been fear crossing his face. He hesitated, his gaze shifting away. He took many photographs," he said, his voice evasive. "But they were lost. In the war." Felicia felt a sense of unease. She sensed that Pierre was holding something back, that he knew more than he was letting on. "Are you sure?" she pressed. "Did he ever leave any photographs here? With you, perhaps?" Pierre shook his head.
"No," he said, his voice firm.
"He took them all with him, back to the front." Felicia didn't believe him. She could see it in his eyes, in the way he avoided her gaze, in the subtle tremor in his hands. He was lying. She decided to change her approach. "I understand," she said, her voice softer. "It must be difficult to remember, to talk about the war." She paused, her gaze shifting to the lighthouse, to the sweeping beam of light that cut through the gathering darkness.
"It's beautiful," she said.
"The lighthouse. It must be a comfort
to those at sea."
A sign of hope. Pierre followed her gaze, his expression softening.
"It is," he said.
"It has guided many ships. Through storms. Through darkness.
To safety."
And it guided Martin." Felicia said, her voice barely a whisper. For a time. Pierre nodded, his eyes filling with tears.
He was a good man, he said.
A kind soul.
He did not deserve to die.
Felicia felt a surge of empathy for the old man. He had known Martin, had shared his friendship, had witnessed his pain. And he was carrying a burden, a secret that weighed heavily on his heart.
Pierre, she said gently. Please.
If you know anything about Martin's photographs about what happened to him, please tell me. I need to know. For him. For myself. Pierre looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and resignation. He sighed deeply, his shoulders slumping. Very well, he said, his voice barely a whisper. I will tell you. But you must promise me. You will not reveal this to anyone. It is a dangerous secret. The keeper kept his secrets well. Chapter 16. A Symphony of Secrets. Felicia leaned closer, her heart pounding with anticipation. The lighthouse keeper's words, heavy with unspoken secrets, hung in the salty air. The rhythmic crash of waves against the rocks below seemed to amplify the tension. I promise, Felicia said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. I won't reveal anything. I just need to know the truth. Pierre nodded slowly, his gaze drifting towards the lighthouse, its beams sweeping across the darkening sea. Corporal Ellis, he was more than just a photographer. He began, his voice low and raspy. He was gathering information about the German movements, about their plans. Felicia's breath caught in her throat.
Martin, a spy.
It made sense in a way. His unusual sensitivities, the special observation mentioned in his military records, it all pointed to a hidden role, a secret mission. He used the lighthouse, Pierre continued, as a signal station. He would communicate with Allied ships, using coded flashes of light. Felicia remembered Martin's words about photography, about capturing the beauty of the world, even amidst the ugliness of war. He had been capturing more than just beauty, he had been capturing secrets, transmitting vital information, playing a dangerous game of espionage. And the photographs? Felicia asked, her voice barely a whisper. What about them? The photographs, they were evidence, Pierre said. Proof of German atrocities. Of war crimes. He planned to expose them. To show the world the truth. Felicia felt a surge of admiration for Martin, for his courage, his determination to fight for justice, even in the face of overwhelming danger. But he was betrayed, Pierre said, his voice filled with sorrow. Someone informed on him. The Germans, they found out. Felicia thought of Clara, of her sister's treachery, of her involvement with the Society of Fading Echoes. Had Clara been the one who betrayed Martin? Had she been responsible for his death? Do you know who betrayed him? Felicia asked, her voice trembling. Pierre shook his head. No, he said. I do not know. But I suspect it was someone close to him. Someone he trusted. The weight of Pierre's words settled heavily on Felicia. The betrayal had come from within, from someone Martin had known, someone he had perhaps even loved. The photographs, Pierre continued, his voice barely audible. He hid them. Here. In the lighthouse. Felicia's heart leaped. The photographs. They were here. All this time. Where? She asked, her voice urgent. Where did he hide them? Pierre gestured towards the lighthouse, towards the winding staircase that led to the top. In the lamp room, he said. Behind the lens. There is a secret compartment. Felicia followed his gaze, her eyes fixed on the lamp room, on the powerful beam of light that cut through the darkness. The secret was hidden there, waiting to be revealed. Can you take me there? She asked, her voice trembling.
Pierre nodded. Yes, he said.
I will take you. But we must be careful. The Germans, they may still be watching. They entered the lighthouse, the air cool and damp, the sound of the sea echoing around them. They climbed the winding staircase, their footsteps echoing on the stone steps. The higher they climbed, the stronger the wind became, the louder the roar of the sea. They reached the lamp room, a circular chamber dominated by the massive Fresnel lens, a complex array of prisms and glass that magnified the light, sending it out across the sea. The air was thick with a scent of oil and salt. Pierre approached the lens, his hands moving with practiced ease. He pressed a hidden catch, and a small section of the lens swung open, revealing a narrow compartment. Inside, nestled amongst the intricate workings of the lens, was a small, metal box. Felicia's heart pounded in her chest. The photographs. Martin's legacy. Pierre carefully removed the box, handing it to Felicia. It was surprisingly heavy, its metal surface cold to the touch. Felicia opened the box, her hands trembling. Inside, neatly stacked, were dozens of black and white photographs. She lifted one out, examining it closely. It showed a scene of devastation, a village reduced to rubble, bodies lying in the streets. It was a stark, brutal image, a testament to the horrors of war. She looked through the other photographs, each one a chilling depiction of German atrocities, of war crimes, of the suffering of innocent civilians. These were the images Martin had risked his life to capture, the evidence he had hoped to use to expose the truth. Felicia felt a surge of emotion, a mixture of grief, anger, and determination. She would not let Martin's sacrifice be in vain. She would find a way to share these photographs with the world, to expose the Germans, to bring them to justice. The symphony that began in a New York office reached crescendo. The Society of Fading Echoes was to be unmasked. Chapter 17. The Painter of Vanishing Dreams. Felicia, clutching the metal box containing Martin's photographs, descended the lighthouse stairs, her mind racing. The images she had seen, stark and brutal, were a testament to Martin's courage and a damning indictment of the enemy's cruelty. She had to find a way to get them to the right people to ensure that they were seen by the world. Pierre, his face etched with worry, walked beside her. "You must be careful, mademoiselle," he said, his voice low. "These photographs, they are dangerous. The Germans, they will stop at nothing to suppress them." "I know," Felicia said, her voice firm, "but I won't let them. Martin risked his life for this. I won't let his sacrifice be in vain." They reached the base of the lighthouse, stepping out into the cool night air. The sea was calm, the stars bright, the beam of the lighthouse sweeping across the darkness, a silent sentinel. "I know someone," Pierre said, his voice hesitant. "An artist. In Paris. He has connections. To the resistance. To the American authorities. He might be able to help you." Felicia felt a flicker of hope. An artist. The resistance. It was a long shot, but it was the best lead she had. "Who is he?" she asked. "What's his name?" "His name is Jean-Luc Dubois," Pierre said. He paints portraits, landscapes. But he also paints other things. Secrets. Hidden messages. He is a master of disguise. Of deception. Felicia remembered Martin's words about photography, about capturing the beauty of the world, even amidst the ugliness of war. This artist, Jean-Luc Dubois, seemed to be doing something similar, using his art to fight a different kind of war, a war of secrets and shadows. "Can you give me his address?" Felicia asked.
Pierre nodded.
He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small, worn piece of paper. He scribbled an address on it, handing it to Felicia. "Be careful, mademoiselle," he said, his voice filled with concern. "Paris, it is a dangerous place, especially now." Felicia thanked Pierre, promising to be cautious. She left the lighthouse, the metal box tucked securely under her arm, her heart filled with a mixture of determination and trepidation. She traveled to Paris, a city that, despite the war, still retained its beauty, its vibrancy, its spirit. But beneath the surface, there was an undercurrent of tension, of fear, of hidden dangers. The streets were filled with soldiers, with refugees, with spies. She found the address Pierre had given her, a narrow, winding street in the Latin Quarter, a haven for artists, writers, and intellectuals. The building was old and weathered, its facade covered in ivy, its windows dark and mysterious. She climbed the stairs to the top floor, her heart pounding in her chest. She knocked on the door, a faded wooden door with a small, brass knocker shaped like a raven. The door opened, revealing a man in his late 30s, with dark, intense eyes and a shock of unruly black hair. He was wearing a paint-splattered smock, his hands stained with various colors. This had to be Jean-Luc Dubois. Mademoiselle? He said, his voice questioning, his eyes scrutinizing her from head to toe. Monsieur Dubois? Felicia said, her voice hesitant. My name is Felicia Wright. Pierre the lighthouse keeper, he gave me your address. Dubois's expression changed, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. He stepped aside, gesturing for her to enter. Come in, mademoiselle, he said.
Come in.
Felicia stepped inside, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. The room was a chaotic jumble of canvases, paints, brushes, and easels. The air was thick with the scent of turpentine and linseed oil. It was a studio, a sanctuary, a place where art and reality collided. Dubois closed the door, his gaze fixed on Felicia. Pierre sent you? He asked, his voice low. Felicia nodded. Yes, she said. He said you might be able to help me. She placed the metal box on a small table, opening it to reveal the photographs. Dubois's eyes widened as he saw the images, his face paling. These are extraordinary, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Where did you get them? Felicia told him the story, the whole story, from the disappearing signature to Martin's death to the discovery of the photographs in the lighthouse. Dubois listened in silence, his gaze fixed on her face, his expression unreadable. When she had finished, he nodded slowly.
Corporal Ellis, he said.
I heard of him. He was a brave man. A true patriot. He was, Felicia said, her voice filled with emotion. And I want to honor his memory. I want to expose the truth. Dubois picked up one of the photographs, examining it closely. These images, they are powerful, he said. They could change the course of the war. They could expose the Germans for what they are. Monsters. But how do we get them to the right people? Felicia asked. How do we make sure they are seen? Dubois smiled, a slow, knowing smile. I have connections, he said. To the resistance. To the American authorities. I can get these photographs to them. I can make sure they are published. But it will be dangerous. I'm not afraid, Felicia said, her voice firm. I've come this far. I won't back down now. The painter, a master of creating and concealing, set his plan. Dreams, once vanishing like Martin's signature, began to solidify into a tangible weapon against the enemy. Chapter 18. The Stolen Kiss Under a Weeping Willow. Dubois studied the photographs, his artist's eye dissecting each image, recognizing not just the horror they depicted, but also their composition, their power to evoke emotion, to incite outrage. He saw in them not just evidence, but a weapon, a tool to sway public opinion, to galvanize support for the war effort. These need to be seen, he said, his voice firm. But we can't simply hand them over to the authorities. The Germans have eyes and ears everywhere. We need to be strategic. He paced the room, his mind racing, formulating a plan. He stopped before a large canvas, covered with a white sheet. I have an exhibition, he said, opening next week, at a prestigious gallery, in the heart of Paris. It will be attended by dignitaries, military officials, journalists, the elite of Parisian society. Felicia felt a flicker of excitement. An exhibition. It was the perfect opportunity. A public forum, a chance to expose the photographs to a wide audience, to create a sensation. But how? She began, her voice hesitant. How can we display these photographs? Without revealing their source? Without endangering ourselves? Dubois smiled, a mischievous glint in his eyes. I am an artist, mademoiselle, he said. I am a master of illusion, of deception. I can hide these photographs in plain sight. He pulled the sheet from the canvas, revealing a large, unfinished painting. It depicted a pastoral scene, a tranquil landscape with rolling hills, a flowing river, and a weeping willow tree in the foreground. This is my masterpiece, he said. Or at least it will be. I call it the Whispers of War. He pointed to the weeping willow tree, its branches cascading down like a curtain. See these leaves? He said. Each one a tiny canvas. I will paint miniature versions of these photographs. Onto the leaves. They will be hidden. Amongst the foliage. Only those who know where to look will see them. Felicia stared at the painting, her mind reeling. It was brilliant. Audacious. Dangerous. But it just might work. But how will people know? She asked. How will they find the hidden images? Du Bois reached into his pocket, pulling out a small, folded piece of paper. He handed it to Felicia. This is an invitation, he said, to the exhibition. I will add a coded message. A subtle clue. Only those who understand the code will know where to look. Felicia unfolded the invitation, examining it closely. It was a beautifully designed card, with an image of the painting on the front. The text was in French, elegant and formal. What will the code be? She asked. Du Bois smiled. A riddle, he said. A play on words. Something that refers to the weeping willow, and to the secrets it hides. He took a pen and added a line to the invitation, beneath the title of the painting. Écoutes les murmures de feuilles qui pleurent. Listen to the whispers of the weeping leaves. Felicia felt a surge of admiration for Du Bois, for his ingenuity, his artistry, his courage. He was risking everything, his reputation, his career, even his life, to help her, to honor Martin's memory. They spent days working together, preparing, and an attraction grew. One evening, as the sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the city, they found themselves standing beneath a weeping willow tree in a nearby park. It was a moment of respite, a brief escape from the tension and danger that surrounded them. It's beautiful, Felicia said, her voice soft, her gaze fixed on the cascading branches of the tree. Yes, Du Bois said, his voice equally soft. It is. He turned to her, his eyes meeting hers. There was a moment of silence, a charged stillness that hung in the air. He reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek. Felicia didn't pull away. She leaned into his touch, her heart pounding in her chest. She had been so focused on her mission, on her grief, on her quest for justice, that she had forgotten what it felt like to be alive, to be desired. Du Bois leaned in, his lips brushing against hers. It was a tentative kiss, a gentle exploration, a spark of connection in a world consumed by darkness. Felicia responded, her arms wrapping around his neck, her body pressing against his. The kiss deepened, becoming more passionate, more urgent. It was a stolen moment, a fleeting embrace, a desperate attempt to find solace, to find love, in the midst of war. They broke apart, breathless, their eyes locked. There was a question in his eyes, a vulnerability that mirrored her own. Jean-Luc, Felicia began, her voice trembling. Felicia, he echoed, his voice equally unsteady. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The kiss had said it all. It was a promise, a hope, a fragile dream of a future that might never be. The stolen kiss, a testament to the enduring power of human connection, lingered on their lips. Chapter 19. The Tribunal of Lost Memories. The night of the exhibition arrived, a swirl of anticipation and nervous energy. Felicia, dressed in a borrowed gown that felt both elegant and alien, stood beside Du Bois in the crowded gallery. The room buzzed with conversation, the clinking of glasses, the rustle of expensive fabrics. Dignitaries, military officials, journalists, and art patrons mingled, their faces reflecting a mixture of curiosity and excitement. Du Bois's painting, The Whispers of War, occupied the central position, drawing the attention of the crowd. The weeping willow, with its meticulously painted leaves, each concealing a miniature version of Martin's photographs, seemed to pulse with a hidden life. Felicia felt a knot of anxiety in her stomach. Everything was riding on Du Bois's artistry, on the coded message in the invitation, on the hope that the right people would see the truth, would understand the significance of the hidden images. She watched as people approached the painting, their eyes scanning the canvas, admiring the pastoral scene. Some paused, their gazes lingering on the weeping willow, their brows furrowed in concentration. Others moved on, oblivious to the secrets hidden within. Du Bois circulated through the crowd, engaging in polite conversation, subtly guiding certain individuals towards the painting, dropping hints, whispering suggestions. He was a master of manipulation, a conductor orchestrating a symphony of secrets. Felicia saw a group of American military officials approach the painting. One of them, A stern-looking general held the invitation in his hand, his eyes fixed on the coded message. He pointed to the weeping willow, whispering something to his companions. They leaned closer, their eyes widening as they began to discern the tiny, hidden images. Felicia felt a surge of relief. It was working. They were seeing the truth. Suddenly, a commotion erupted near the entrance of the gallery. Felicia turned, her heart leaping into her throat. A group of men, dressed in dark suits, were pushing their way through the crowd, their faces grim, their eyes scanning the room. Germans. Felicia felt a wave of panic. They had been discovered. The exhibition was compromised. Du Bois, seeing the approaching men, quickly moved towards Felicia. "We need to leave," he whispered urgently.
Now.
But it was too late. The German officers had spotted them. They pointed, shouting orders. The crowd scattered, a wave of panic spreading through the gallery. Felicia and Du Bois found themselves surrounded, trapped. One of the officers, a tall, imposing man with a cruel face, approached them, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. "You are Jean-Luc Du Bois?" he said, his voice harsh, his accent thick. Du Bois nodded, his face pale but composed. "I am," he said. "And this woman?" the officer asked, his gaze shifting to Felicia. "She is my assistant," Du Bois said. The officer smirked.
"We know who you are," he said.
"And we know what you are hiding." He gestured towards the painting, towards the weeping willow. "Those photographs," he said. "They are lies. Propaganda. We will confiscate them. And you will be arrested." Felicia felt a surge of despair. They had failed. They had been so close, but now was over. Suddenly, a voice rang out from across the room. "Those photographs are not lies." Everyone turned to see the American general, the one who had deciphered the coded message, standing before the painting, his face red with anger. He held up one of Martin's photographs, a particularly graphic image of a war crime. "This is the truth," he said, his voice booming. "This is what the Germans are doing. This is the barbarity they are inflicting on innocent civilians." He turned to the other guests, his voice rising in intensity. "I have seen the evidence," he said. "With my own eyes. These photographs, they are authentic. They are a testament to the horrors of this war. And we must not ignore them." The room fell silent, the air thick with tension. The German officers hesitated, their faces contorted with fury. They had been exposed, their lies revealed. The American general turned to Felicia, his eyes filled with a mixture of admiration and gratitude. You are a brave woman, Miss Wright," he said. "You have done a great service. To your country, to the world." The other guests began to murmur, their voices rising in agreement. The tide had turned. The Germans, outnumbered and outmaneuvered, were forced to retreat, their mission a failure. Felicia felt a wave of relief, of triumph, of vindication. Martin's sacrifice had not been in vain. His photographs, his legacy, had been revealed to the world. Justice, though delayed, had finally prevailed. The makeshift tribunal, a gallery filled with art and secrets, had delivered its verdict. Chapter 20. The Reckoning of Ink and Blood. The aftermath of the exhibition was a whirlwind of activity. The American military officials, spurred by the evidence presented in Martin's photographs, launched a full-scale investigation into German war crimes. The photographs were published in newspapers and magazines around the world, sparking outrage and condemnation. The tide of public opinion, already shifting against the Germans, turned decisively. Felicia found herself thrust into the spotlight, hailed as a heroine, a courageous woman who had risked everything to expose the truth. She gave interviews, spoke at rallies, testified before committees. But she found little solace in the accolades. The victory felt hollow, tinged with the bitterness of loss. Du Bois, his identity as a member of the resistance revealed, was forced to go into hiding. He and Felicia shared a tearful farewell, a promise of a future that might never be, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that had formed between them, forged in the crucible of danger and shared purpose. Felicia, weary of the attention, of the constant reminders of her loss, decided to return to the United States. She had done what she had set out to do. She had honored Martin's memory, had exposed the truth, had brought a measure of justice to a world consumed by war. She booked passage on a ship heading back to New York, a journey that mirrored her earlier voyage to France, but with a profound difference. She was no longer chasing shadows, no longer seeking answers. She was returning home, carrying the weight of her experiences, the scars of her loss, the bittersweet satisfaction of a mission accomplished. As the ship sailed across the Atlantic, Felicia spent hours on deck, staring out at the vast expanse of water, reflecting on the events of the past few months. She thought of Martin, of his bravery, his idealism, his tragic fate. She thought of Clara, of her sister's betrayal, of her death, of the tangled web of secrets that had shattered their family. She thought of Du Bois, of his artistry, his courage, his stolen kiss, of the fleeting connection they had shared. She realized that the war, though fought on distant battlefields, had touched every aspect of her life, had changed her irrevocably. She had lost her innocence, her illusions, her sense of security. But she had also found strength, resilience, a deeper understanding of the complexities of human nature, of the enduring power of love and loyalty, even in the face of unimaginable loss. The ship arrived in New York Harbor, the city skyline looming before her, a familiar yet alien landscape. She disembarked, stepping back onto American soil, feeling a mixture of relief and trepidation. She returned to her father's house, the sprawling brownstone on the Upper East Side, a place that now felt empty, haunted by memories. Her father greeted her with a mixture of joy and sorrow, his face etched with the lines of worry and grief. They embraced, a silent acknowledgement of the shared pain they had endured, of the bond that still held them together, despite the tragedies that had befallen them. Felicia went to her father's study, the room where it had all begun, with the disappearing signature. She sat at the desk, staring at the blank space where the letter had once been. It was as if Martin had never existed, never written those words, never shared that brief, poignant moment with her. But she knew he had. She had seen his photographs, had witnessed his bravery, had felt his spirit. He was gone, but his legacy lived on, in the images he had captured, in the truth he had revealed, in the hearts of those who had known him. She reached into her pocket, pulling out a small, silver locket, the one she had worn throughout her journey. She opened it, revealing the miniature portrait of her father. She carefully removed the portrait, replacing it with a small, faded photograph, one she had found tucked away in the metal box with Martin's other images. It was a photograph of Martin, taken in the lighthouse, his face illuminated by the beam of light, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and determination. It was a reminder of the man he had been, of the sacrifice he had made, of the enduring power of his spirit. Felicia closed the locket, holding it tightly in her hand. The reckoning of ink and blood had been made, and the truth had prevailed. A single tear escaped. Epilogue. Years passed. The war ended. The world slowly began to heal, to rebuild, to move on. But the scars remained, etched on the landscape, on the hearts of those who had lived through the conflict. Felicia never married. She dedicated her life to preserving Martin's legacy, working with veterans organizations, advocating for peace, sharing his photographs with museums and historical societies. She wanted to ensure that his story, and the stories of countless others who had sacrificed their lives, would never be forgotten. She often visited the cemetery where her sister, Clara, was buried, a simple, unmarked grave in a quiet corner of the grounds. She would stand there, staring at the empty space, feeling a mixture of sorrow and regret, of anger and forgiveness. She would never fully understand Clara's choices, her betrayal, her descent into darkness. But she had come to accept it, to make peace with the past, to move on with her life. She occasionally received letters from Du Bois, brief, cryptic notes from a life still lived in the shadows, a reminder of the connection they had shared, of the stolen kiss under the weeping willow, of the dream of a future that had never materialized. She cherished those letters, tucked them away with the other mementos of her past, a testament to the enduring power of human connection, even in the face of loss and separation. One autumn day, many years after the war, Felicia found herself walking through Gramercy Park. The leaves were turning, a riot of red and gold, the air crisp and cool. She paused before the statue of Edwin Booth, the bronze figure gazing out over the manicured lawns, a silent witness to the passage of time, to the ebb and flow of human history. She remembered that night, the clandestine meeting of the Society of Fading Echoes, the ghostly apparition of Martin, the desperate plea for help. It seemed like a lifetime ago, a distant memory from a world that had vanished, replaced by a new era, a new reality. As she stood there, lost in thought, she noticed a young woman sitting on a nearby bench, sketching in a notebook. The woman looked up, her eyes meeting Felicia's. There was something familiar about her, something that tugged at the edges of Felicia's memory. The young woman smiled, a tentative, hesitant smile. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" she said, her voice soft, her accent French. Felicia nodded. "Yes," she said. "It is. I come here often," the young woman said. "To sketch. To remember." "Remember?" Felicia asked, her voice curious. The young woman hesitated, her gaze shifting away. "My grandfather," she said. He lived in Paris. During the war. He was an artist." Felicia felt a jolt of recognition, a sudden understanding.
Du Bois.
This was Du Bois's granddaughter. His name was it Jean-Luc? Felicia asked, her voice trembling. The young woman's eyes widened in surprise. "Yes," she said. How did you know?" Felicia smiled, a bittersweet smile tinged with sadness and nostalgia. "I knew him," she said. "A long time ago. He was a brave man. A true artist." The young woman nodded, her eyes filling with tears. He told me stories," she said. "About the war. About a woman. An American. Who he helped." Felicia reached out, her hand gently touching the young woman's arm. "He helped many people," she said. He changed the world." They sat in silence for a moment, a shared connection bridging the gap of years, of generations, of loss and remembrance. The echoes of the past, though fading, still resonated, a testament to the enduring power of love, of courage, of the human spirit. The disappearing signature had, in its own way, led to an enduring legacy.